right. Well, welcome Legacy Bible. Welcome Legacy Bible Church. We're here on Wednesday morning with Sarah, and we're going to have question and answer. And I'm always excited to have this conversation, Sarah.
Yes, you are.
And hear what we're going to talk about.
That's the first thing you asked me. What's our question?
Yeah.
Okay. So I am going to give you my thought process of what brought me, because
Yeah.
I've had a conversation with a friend about scriptures, that they're written by humans. Humans make mistakes. How can we trust those? So I kind of had that bouncing around in my mind a lot this week. And then as I was listening Sunday, I was just thinking about how you talked about Sunday morning, how how Luke, when he was writing, because we were talking in Luke, how he was writing word for word what Jesus said, but he was reflecting back on, time when he was with Jesus, and then it occurred to me, the men that wrote the Bible were brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
They were educated. Their memories are not anything like what we even experience for ourselves. Our education, I feel like, and I could be wrong, is very limited.
Because they exercise their
They
memory
exercise,
more.
right.
Yeah.
They had to, and they just did. They had stuff memorized. They had the Torah memorized. So when they're back reflecting, we can trust that their memory was right. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about how when we read the Bible, it's written a certain way, then you will come in and you're like, okay, it's translated this, and these words mean this, and you have to take this and this and this all together. We can't separate. And so I just got to thinking, these men that were writing it were brilliant, were educated, they had just, I would keep thinking brilliant. They knew what they were talking about. But when they were writing to the people of the church, did the people of the church understand what they were writing? I mean, they didn't have to sit and give big backgrounds. I mean, they were just writing to these people that were there. Some were probably there at the time. So did they understand the scriptures? You have to unpack so much. And when you do unpack it, it makes so much sense. But Luke didn't unpack it, right?
Yeah, Luke left a lot to be taught, but let me try to answer your question this way, and this is such a good question. It really, and again, as usual, Sarah, this is bigger than just your narrow question. This really gets to the heart of how our Bible has been translated into English, and which, quite frankly, not well.
Right.
Because the gospel has not been fully understood, it's not being fully taught. And I guess I would say it this way. The gospel is highly nuanced. It's far deeper. It's not complicated.
Right.
Once you understand it, it's actually quite simple. But it's far deeper and far more magnificent than our church is teaching today. And it is reflected, the fullness of the glory and the magnificence of the gospel is fully reflected in the New Testament writings. But because it's not been understood and taught properly due to bad tradition and bad teaching in the church that goes all the way back to the earliest centuries of the church, I've taught about the competing traditions in the early church. Because it's not been understood and taught fully, properly, it has not been, that has resulted in it not being translated well. And so you really get to the heart of an example that I taught about this past Sunday, which is Luke's grammatical construction. In chapter 22, verses 40 and 46. This is where your question is coming from, right? From my teaching on Sunday.
Yes, sir.
And essentially a parallel passage in Luke chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, where Jesus is being baptized, prays, comes out of the water, and very similar grammatical construction there. So put on your thinking cap here, church. You're listening here. You're going to hear some things that You're probably not going to hear from your pulpit because it's not been understood, but I'm going to talk about how Luke wrote compared to the other gospel writers, Mark and Matthew, why he did a slight variation, why that's acceptable, and what it means in Luke's redacted version. So the idea here that Sarah is you're alluding to is the idea of prayer, and the fact that Luke refers to Jesus' command to his disciples right before he's going to go to the cross. Jesus says at Gethsemane, when Jesus is praying and he comes to his disciples, finds them sleeping, and he commands them, pray to not enter into temptation. He uses an imperative command, pray, put an exclamation mark on that, pray. And then he attaches to that an infinitive. I'm not going to get into the nuance of grammatically what that means, but just to say that the infinitive that he attaches to the command is to not enter and then into temptation. Well, an imperative verb with an infinitive is pray to not enter is not two separate actions, it's one. And so that's uniquely Luke. Mm-hmm. That construction of the use of the verb proseuchomai, to pray, with an attached infinitive is not found anywhere else in the Bible, not in the Greek Old Testament and not in the Greek New Testament, except here in Luke with Jesus' command at the Garden of Gethsemane, in the words of Jesus, and Luke in chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, where Jesus is being baptized. Now, Luke is narrating there, but he does the same thing. He narrates with the verb proseuchomai, to pray, with attached infinitives. Pray to open heaven, to descend the Holy Spirit, to become a voice from heaven. Those three infinitives. So here's, I want to say this in as simple a way as possible for the audience that's listening, because I think this is your question. Then I'm going to come back to you and I'd say, is this your question? Okay. Did we get it? So Luke is narrating, I'm back in chapter 22 at the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke is narrating a command from Jesus, and he is using the imperative with an infinitive. Now, in the Matthean version, and actually it's in the Markan version, you don't have that in the Matthean version, but in the Markan version, you have just a different construction, pray in order that you might not enter into temptation. He actually separates it with a hina clause. Now, in the Lucan version, he has that command in verse 22:46, the parallel Markan command, but he also starts that passage with his version, pray to not enter. And so Luke actually adds to the Markan version with that unique construction. What's Luke doing there? He doesn't do anything by accident. Luke is making sure that the readers do not read just the Markan version where it's the command is separated with a hina clause, pray in order that you might not enter into temptation. Luke is making sure that the reader can understand with his redacted version, where he includes pray in the beginning of that passage, pray to not enter, that it in fact is one action. It's not two actions, it's one action. Luke is creating what they would call in literary terms an inclusio by adding that to the beginning, and it's what they call a redacted version, assuming Mark's version was first. Luke is adding to it for the sake of clarity. And what his addition does is clarify that this is not two actions. This is one action. His addition with the command and the attached infinitive is essentially to say in grammatical terms that it's one action. Pray to not enter into temptation. That, in other words, this is a mode of prayer that is intrinsically void, absent the realm of temptation. Gets right back to the Lord's Prayer, where he said in Luke chapter 11, do not carry us into temptation. It's actually carrying that same thought here in chapter 22 at the Garden of Gethsemane. Pray to not enter into temptation. It's a mode of prayer that's absent temptation. Now, the only other place where this type of grammatical construction can be found in the entire Greek Bible, including Old Testament and New Testament, is also in Luke in chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, where Jesus is being baptized, comes up out of the water, he's praying, and it's the same thing, the verb proseuchomai, to pray, with attached infinitives. Pray, to open heaven, to descend the Holy Spirit bodily like a dove, to make or to cause to happen a voice from heaven. And then that's when the voice from heaven says, you are my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. The voice from heaven. So Luke's entire purpose, Luke doesn't do anything by accident. This kind of construction with the verb and the infinitive in the whole Bible is only found in these two places. Jesus being baptized and praying, Jesus commanding to his disciples at Gethsemane right before he goes to the cross. And obviously he's looking forward to the new covenant. This is what he is foreshadowing, what he's thinking about when he says to them, pray not entering into temptation. And so Luke, in a holistic way, Luke in the beginning of Luke chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, with Jesus being baptized, praying to open heaven, to cause or to descend the Holy Spirit like a dove in bodily form, to cause to happen a voice from heaven. Luke is correlating those two, and that's his literary way of teaching his reader that the prayer Jesus is commanding his disciples to do in Gethsemane right before his crucifixion, which is pointing to the new covenant mode of prayer that's going to be enabled through Jesus' continued ministry, that type of prayer that he's commanding to his disciples correlates, this is Luke's intention here, correlates to the prayer Jesus prayed when he came up out of the water being baptized, opened heaven, descended the Holy Spirit like a dove in bodily form, caused to happen a voice from heaven. Those are correlated. That's Luke's purpose. That's his intention. Luke was a physician. He was highly educated. He's been called Luke the stylist in terms of his rhetorical way of writing. A very highly developed, what you might call highly educated rhetorical ability to use the Greek language to convey ideas. And you see that on full display here with Luke's use in chapter 22, verse 40, and chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, where he uses in both places, both relating to prayer, this very unique construction of the verb with attached infinitives, which infer one action. In both cases, they're prayer that is defined by the infinitives. So that the prayer in verse 22 of not entering into temptation correlates, this is Luke's intention, correlates to the prayer demonstrated by Jesus that opens the heavens, that descends the Holy Spirit bodily like a dove, and cause to happen a voice from heaven. They're correlated. That's Luke's intention. He wants his reader, those teaching his gospel, the book of Luke, to teach the people, because often teaching is verbal, And Luke wants his readers and teachers who are teaching based on his gospel to correlate those two. That's why he used that unique construction in both places, so that when he gets to the end of the gospel and he's teaching about Jesus' command to his disciples to pray, to not enter into temptation, the teacher, knowing about this grammatical tie, can go back to chapter 3 and say, here's what Jesus means. Jesus is saying that this is the prayer, not only not entering into temptation, but this is the prayer that opens heaven, that descends the Holy Spirit like a dove in bodily form. Bodily what? This body. And causes a voice from heaven. What? Those unknowable utterances that are being prayed. That's Luke's intention. It's fascinating, it's magnificent, it's marvelous when you see it and you understand it. And Luke wrote it because he intended that those that would read his gospel would understand that purpose and would teach that purpose. Yes, he wrote that to be understood. And unfortunately, you can read your English translations, that nuance, that grammatical construction is lost in translation. You can't see it in the English translations, but it is there in stark daylight in the Greek. And of course, in the Stauros, the wooden Bible, one of the reasons why it sounds wooden is I carry that grammatical nuance into the English. Even though it doesn't sound like natural English, the meaning is still there and it's still conveyed in the English. And so that's one of the purposes of Stauros, the wooden Bible. So tell me, how well have I addressed your question here?
Yes, so he wrote it intending that the people reading it were going to pick that up. So, I mean, I don't
particularly the teachers.
The teachers, because I guess just an ordinary person wouldn't go and pick up.
Well, ordinary people are not going to read. They're going to be taught by
Right.
somebody. And so the teacher presumably is going to have source material to learn from, one of which is the Gospel of Luke. And so by that time, they've got Matthew and they've got Mark, and the teacher that is well-versed in Greek can look at the three versions in their original language and say, why did Matthew use participles and Mark used participles, but Luke is suddenly using the infinitive? Why did he do that? Someone that is well-versed in Greek is going to know exactly why Luke did that, and is going to be able to then convey that to his listeners, because most teaching was verbal. And he'll be able to convey to his listeners that here's what Luke did with his grammatical construction, and here's what Luke is doing that in order to bring clarity and elaboration on what we read in Matthew and Mark. Luke is essentially saying, don't miss the fact, which you can with the participle. The participle can be inferred as independent verbal actions. Luke is saying, don't do that. And so he very purposely redacts, emends the text of Mark and Matthew with, instead of using the participle, he uses the infinitive. And that's his way of saying this is one action, not two. Now, Matthew and Mark intended it the same way, but Luke, I would say Luke is more versed in the Greek language than the authors of Matthew and Mark were.
And had Luke read Matthew and Mark before?
I think he had.
You think so?
I think he had. I think that's why he wrote it the way he did. And there are other examples of that we won't get into here, but there are other examples where Luke does exactly the same thing. He makes slight modifications to the text of Matthew and or Mark, and it's always with the intention of clarifying something that might be, and ostensibly probably was, conveyed maybe not fully accurately. And Luke wanted to make sure that his version was razor sharp on some of these critical issues. One of which is that this prayer is a prayer that innately is independent of temptation, that opens the heavens, that descends the Holy Spirit like a dove in bodily form, and causes to happen the voice of God. He wanted to make sure that we're not mistaking this here. This is one action, that this prayer innately includes these attributes. And he did that by using the infinitive instead of the participle.
So my next question would be, which I don't know if we have time because there's probably not a short answer. The next question then to follow that up is, if he intended it to be understood this way, so a teacher picking it up in this time read this and understood it and is teaching it, then why did it get lost? Why did someone just say...
Good question.
And I know that's probably really...
And the reason is this. If you don't walk in the fullness of the gospel, in other words, if you don't pray according to that mode of prayer, praying in the Spirit, worshiping in spirit and truth, Spirit-enabled prayers of unknowable utterances, speaking in tongues, spiritually spoken worship, if you don't pray in that manner, I'm going to say it's going to be virtually impossible for you to connect these nuanced grammatical constructions. And so then it's going to be almost creates a motivation that those that are only walking in a partial gospel, which the church generally has for most of its history, if you're only walking in a partial gospel, you're going to see these changes, these nuances, and they're going to, this is what's happened, church, they're going to be changed, altered, twisted, if you will, contorted, in order that it'll make sense to them in the partial gospel they're walking in. And so the reason, to your point, the reason that it's gotten lost from the church is that very early on it got lost in the teachings because the church walked away from the fullness of the gospel. And they're only walking in a partial gospel. And they're going to read these highly nuanced grammatical constructions in the context of their tradition in a partial gospel. And that's what's happened.
Okay, so this might be a good place for our final thought. I've always read the Bible and thought it's a mystery never to be, because it seems so hard to understand. In my mind, I think it's a mystery never to be understood, when in reality, Luke is writing it so it's not a mystery to never be understood.
That's right. Luke is writing for crystal clear, razor sharp understanding.
They're not trying to make it this hard thing that we can't grasp. That changes everything.
The teacher has got to, it's almost essential that if you're going to understand this highly nuanced, razor sharp rhetoric of Luke, you're going to have to be walking in that gospel. If you're not walking in that gospel, if you believe another tradition, it's virtually impossible for someone who is walking in just a partial gospel. It's virtually impossible to see the full razor sharpness of his rhetoric. But if you're walking in the fullness of the gospel, if you've got the full uncorrupted text, or a good teacher that is teaching from an uncorrupted text, then that fullness is there. It's crystal clear, it's razor sharp, and it can be taught like that. That was Luke's intention with his writing.
That clarifies so much, because so many times I thought, well, they just must be writing this secret code that we can't understand because it's a mystery, and it requires us every day to try to figure it out more and more, when really they were writing it to clarify so that it would, even Paul was not writing, yes, his stuff was sometimes hard to understand, but he wanted us to understand. He didn't want us to be in dark.
That's right.
So
and it is going to be a mystery if you don't. If you're walking in just a partial gospel, right? It's going to be a mystery.
Big mystery.
Yeah. And so that is the reason why these things that are difficult to understand get altered in translation.
And that's why, you just can't. You can never make scriptures come to light until you are walking in the fullness of it. You just can't.
And so that's our teaching at Legacy Bible Church.
Right.
And our prayer, our desire, our excitement for our listeners is that as they listen to the teaching of the fullness of the gospel, that you will become worshipers of God in spirit and truth, that you will walk in the fullness of the gospel. And that's where, and for another teaching, this is an amazing passage in Luke in chapter 24. That's where the full understanding of the scriptures, really the fog begins to lift and you begin to see this amazing, magnificent story about God's salvation plan. It's far greater than the church as it exists today is teaching, aside from, as far as I know, aside from the teaching here at Legacy Bible Church.
Yeah, I've never heard it anywhere else either.
So thank you again,
Thank
Sarah. You bring such great questions that people may be thinking about, or you spark their imagination with your questions, and there's just so much power in that, and I just appreciate the opportunity to have you and to talk about these things with you.
And we want to hear your questions.
Absolutely.
Because I can't be the only one asking questions.
We want your questions. We want your comments.
Yeah.
Steve.Goodall at lbcdfw.org. That's Legacy Bible Church, Dallas, Fort Worth, lbcdfw.org. Send us your comments. Send us your questions. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be back with another teaching on Sunday at 10:30, and God willing, Sarah, we'll be back with another question
Yes.
next week.
I got more.
All right.